Molly Worthen is a history professor here at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. What courses do you teach, Professor Worthen?
I teach a big survey course on the history of religion in North America. I teach a course on modern American intellectual history. One of the most fun courses I teach is called Sin and Evil in Modern America, which is a small research seminar. You can imagine the kinds of things the students get into in that class.
Well, you're also the author of this book, Apostles of Reason, The Crisis of Authority in American Evangelicalism, published by Oxford. What is evangelicalism?
That's a great question. Any scholar or observer who tries to explain what's going on in modern American politics and religion has to contend with this very slippery term. And some scholars have tried to define evangelicalism in terms of a checklist of shared doctrines. Doctrines like an emphasis on a born-again conversion experience, a high view of the authority of the Bible, an emphasis on evangelism. I think those lists are helpful, but in my research I was trying to find a definition that would allow me to corral a huge diversity of conservative Protestants, from pacifist Mennonites to tongue-speaking Pentecostals. And I came to the conclusion that these folks don't agree so much on a list of doctrines as they do on a set of shared questions. So I found myself focusing on the questions they ask rather than the answers.
You use the word conservative. Do you have to be conservative to be an evangelical?
Well, I use that word a bit loosely. Certainly you don't have to be politically conservative, but I think all evangelicals are invested in preserving what we might call a traditional orientation toward Christianity and toward the authority of the Bible. I found them all wrestling with really three major concerns or anxieties that have to do with this transition into modernity. The first is how you keep faith and reason joined as one unified way of knowing the world. The second is how you attain assurance of your own salvation, how you cultivate a relationship with the divine or meet and know Jesus, to use the language some evangelicals use. And the third is how you reconcile your own personal faith with an increasingly secular, increasingly pluralistic public square, and how you do all of this in the absence of a single magisterial authority that can guide individual believers through these thorny questions.
Is evangelicalism unique to Christianity?
It has some impulses that are perhaps shared by communities in other faiths. So there is a subset of evangelicalism that we might call fundamentalism. Fundamentalists take a particularly militant approach to what they perceive to be changes, heterodoxies, both in modern religion and in modern culture. And often their answer is to separate, to form their own community and fight back against that. And we can identify a fundamentalist strain in really every major world religion, from Islam to Buddhism to Judaism. All the world religions have some subset of individuals who say, you know what, we cannot compromise with modernity. We have to guard our heritage and take a stand.
You open Apostles of Reason with a story about Karl Barth and Karl Henry. Who are they?
Karl Barth was the most important Protestant theologian of the 20th century. I think there's really no question. He was not an evangelical in our common understanding of the term. He played fast and loose with some basic traditional beliefs of Christianity. He was willing to say, we need not believe that the resurrection of Christ was a historical, empirical fact in the same way that the headlines in the Sunday newspaper were. Karl Henry was an evangelical journalist and thinker who had come of age in the battles between fundamentalists and modernists that really shaped American Protestantism in the early 20th century. And in the 1950s, he had helped found a magazine called Christianity Today, which was aimed at resurrecting the intellectual reputation of conservative evangelicalism in the wake of the Scopes trial and this equation in the mainstream mind between conservative Protestantism and anti-intellectual rejection of science and history. Karl Barth had come to Washington, D.C. on a lecture tour, and Henry was covering his visit in his capacity as an editor. And they got into this confrontation at Barth's news conference. Henry raised his hand and said, "Mr. Barth, can you tell us whether, if there had been reporters, as are in this room today, if there had been reporters in first century Palestine, would they have covered the resurrection of Christ in the same way that they cover today's news, the Yankees score, this sort of thing?" Barth burst out laughing, and he said, "Did you say the name of your magazine was Christianity Today or Christianity Yesterday?" And the whole room burst out laughing because most of the reporters were on his side. But Henry stood his ground and said, "Christianity yesterday, today, and forever." And he recounts this incident in his memoirs as a moment in which he really stood up to the corrosive forces of modernity and asserted a place at the table for conservative Protestants in talking about the future of Christianity and its engagement with modernity.
And that was in 1960?
Yes, I think that's right.
Or circa
Around there,
1960. Yeah. Are the same battles still going on in Christianity today?
I think to some extent, yes, and they have been going on for centuries. My book is the kind of the backstory to the rise of the Christian right. It's really about what I call an intellectual civil war that's been going on among evangelicals, I would say, since the beginning of their movement in the aftermath of the Reformation, but in a kind of new and newly acute way in the years since World War II. And each episode, each era is slightly different, and I think that the conflicts in the current generation of evangelicals, particularly younger evangelicals, Generation X, millennial evangelicals, are slightly different than the battles that their parents fought, but they are iterations of the same fundamental tension between traditional Christianity and modern Western secularism.
Molly Worthen, we think of the term Christian right as a political term.
That's right. And my claim is that if we focus solely on politics, we miss the bigger picture. I'm not suggesting that you can understand the rise of the Christian right as we commonly think of it in the 70s and 80s without paying attention to the backlash against the liberation movements of the 1960s, or without attending to the context of the Cold War and anti-communism. Those are all crucial. However, to really understand the intellectual fight that is at the core, I think, of the conflict between the Christian right and secular liberals, you have to go back, frankly, to the 17th century, if not before. You have to go back to the origins of a particular way of interpreting the Bible that seeks to borrow the framework of science, the framework of modern intellectual inquiry, and defend the Bible against a new set of attacks, primarily on the part of secular scientists, of the first emissaries of the Enlightenment. This is the doctrine of biblical inerrancy. And while to some degree this is an ancient idea, Christians have been concerned to defend the Bible as a perfect source of truth since Christianity's beginnings. Their means of mounting this defense took on a new shape in really the middle of the 17th century as they tried to fend off attacks from both the new scientists and philosophers of the Enlightenment, as well as Catholic theologians of the Catholic Counter-Reformation. And a group of Protestant theologians developed this pseudo-scientific, hyper-rationalistic way of defending the Bible that really came into full flower in the context of the American fundamentalist movement, but was never the only way Protestants had interpreted the authority of the Bible, and won the day and really became the main intellectual mode of the evangelicals we think of as the Christian right, because it seemed to speak to this secular threat on its own terms. And it became kind of a rallying cry as conservative Protestants increasingly over the course of the 20th century felt they were losing control of their culture.
How significant was the Scopes monkey trial?
The Scopes monkey trial was very significant. Now, the basic facts of this trial may